Hello again. Today I want to do a little video over an incident that happened at my place this winter. It was caught before it became a serious problem, but it could have become a rather serious problem if we hadn't caught it in time. And what that was a driver showed up to my place to load. Earlier that morning, he had offloaded, and then he came back to my place to get another load. I was up on the towers hooking up rail cars when he pulled in, saw him hook up. This was an experienced driver, been pulling out of my place for quite a while. Hooks up, hear the pumps run, he's taking off, he's loading. So I'm just busy doing my stuff, get all the cars hooked up, we're making sure everything's flowing good. I'm still up at the towers. At my terminal, it normally takes about 13-14 minutes to load a truck. So I wasn't up at the towers for a really long time. And so the pumps are running, and I'm always trying to pay attention. Anytime I'm outside, the pump sounded good, everything seemed good. And about the time, mentally I'm thinking he's probably got to be about done, I hear my pumps go into distress. My pumps are laboring, and I'm now coming down the stairs, and I see the driver out there, and I'm yelling at the driver, stop the pumps right now. So he does. I get over there, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, something's gone wrong with my pumps. Something must have junked out. Something must have happened. And he's standing there looking at me, and he says, I don't know what the problem is. He said, I programmed the heads with the same amount of gallons I always do, and they're almost done. What's going on? I said, well, let's look. So I'm looking around. I don't see anything obviously wrong with my pumps. I go over there. His pressure gauge, or not his pressure gauge, his percent gauge is down past 95%, which is just a percent gauge. They're somewhat accurate, so that didn't tell me anything that much to begin with, but I went to look at his pressure gauge. Looked at his pressure gauge, and he had 200 psi in his trailer. As cold as it was when he was here, trucks would normally leave my place about 80-85 pounds of pressure. So when he's at 200, I told him, I said, you're full. He said, that's not possible. Went over there, looked at the heads, and sure enough, he put in the same number of gallons were programmed into the heads, and it had almost made a complete delivery into his trailer, but we stopped it short. I said, well, either you left product in your trailer from your last delivery, or my meters have gone bad, and I'm putting in far more product than what my meters are registering. He said, well, it can't be me. He said, it can't be what I did. He said, because I offloaded the same as I always do, and I always, try to prove that my trailer's empty. And he said, I'm sure my trailer was empty. I said, well, all the drivers have been loading before you have been loading without incident. But that does not mean that my meters could have just junked out. That's always a possibility. So I went ahead, had him disconnect, had him drive over to another bulkhead on my property, and began to offloading. And while we were offloading, I began to talk to him and ask him, well, what is your whole procedure when you offload? How many RPMs do you turn your pump? At what point do you slow your pump down prior to completely emptying out the trailer? And he says, we don't. Always run the same speed from beginning to end. I said, well, you're not supposed to do that. And so I began to explain to him the whole process of a Coriolis effect in the propane as it's feeding into the pump in his trailer if he keeps his RPMs up too high. And so I wanted to share that with you, because it's not the first time a driver's come to my place loaded and say, well, My percent gauge on my trailer is reading higher than it should be. There might be something wrong with your meters. And my answer is, well, how do you know you didn't leave product in your trailer? Because the fact is, there are several variables that fall into it, but it's not uncommon for a trailer to show up at a terminal and have anywhere from 100, maybe even 400 gallons of liquid left in the trailer. For a lot of reasons, but I'm going to show you the most common reason, in my opinion and my personal experience, as to why trailers have residual product left in them when they show up. So I'll explain it to you in essentially the same way I explained it to this driver, minus a whiteboard. This is just, pretend we're just looking into a trailer. And let's say he's normally full of liquid and he's about 90% full. So now you have all the weight of all this product shoving essentially gravity, using gravity to feed the internal valve that feeds the pump. So when this pump is turning, those vanes are spinning. And you're familiar with how vane pumps work. Most of you probably are, although there's some you may not. But as that vane comes around, there's 6 vanes in that pump, and as they're going around, each time they go, they just grab a bite. And as you've got that going in there, every bite in the beginning is just a bite of all liquid, just a full bite of liquid, going and going and going. And another common thing is trying to figure out how fast that pump is spinning. Normally, for a pump, of course, you know, there's always variables, but generally, you're somewhere between 650 to 800 RPMs. You can take those pumps faster. Some guys will run them up to 1,000 RPMs. It just depends on the truck, because they have a PTO on their transmission that has a gear reducer. So, you know, they may be 800 RPMs on their engine speed or 1,200 on their engine speed, whatever it takes to get it. But generally, they're going to be running somewhere, should be running somewhere around there. Some of them may run these pumps, like I said, up to 1,000 RPMs. You can get away with a higher RPM as you're going around. It's just that right now we're using gravity to push into the vanes. So as they're coming around rather quickly, you want to make that, in order for that pump to be as efficient as possible, it needs to get a full bite. Every time those vanes slide up and down, as they slide up, you want them to get a full bite of product so that they can dump it out. And part of we also have to keep in mind is that this is 4-inch going into the pump and 2-inch coming out. So right there's a restriction. Right there's another obstacle for that pump to overcome. And some people may say, well, you know, that pump has an internal bypass. Yes, it does. And that bypass bypasses right back into the pump. So it's not like a bypass we would have on our pumps loading a truck, where it would run to a separate return line. It's just going to go right back into the pump itself. So it's just an emergency stopgap. It's not designed to constantly control overpressure. So as this thing is spinning around and we start off at 90 and we're going down in here, even if they are running it too fast, there is going to be still getting a good bite. But when you take this liquid volume down to about 15%, maybe 20, we now have a lot less weight of product going into that internal valve feeding the pump. Another thing we have going on is that all of this space that was occupied by liquid is now trying to be occupied by propane vapor. So that means what product that's in here is just bubbling off all the time, just bubbling off, trying to fill in that space. So that does, as to how much it affects, I'm not sure, but it does incorporate a temperature and a pressure change inside this trailer as he's doing it. What a driver should do, whether it's a bobtail driver or transport driver, they should, when they hit around 15 to 20%, they should cut their RPMs down by at least 100. Then when you get down again to about 10%, that driver should really just kick it all the way down to idle and let that pump run at idle, whatever the engine idle is. Because now we have even less weight going down in there, and we always have that something to consider is a Coriolis effect as we're running product out. And a Coriolis effect would be essentially like a whirlpool running, and that whirlpool is going to be over this pump area. The way to mitigate the Coriolis effect is to slow your RPMs down, make this less aggressive. Because when you combine the fact that we now have less weight, we're having a change in pressure and a change in temperature inside this trailer with the product as we're constantly boiling off. This Coriolis effect, if you maintain a high RPM on the pump, this Coriolis effect, this whirlpool, has got a tail to it. And that tail will go up and down depending on speed of the pump and the movement of the product, because this stuff's not static. This stuff's moving to one degree or another inside here because it's boiling off and you have the action of the pump. There's always some movement of the liquid inside the trailer. So when that Coriolis, when that whirlpool starts dipping in, the tail of it starts dipping in that internal valve, you're now mixing a great percentage of propane vapor in with the propane liquid, and now those veins, as they come around, are getting more and more and more inefficient. You're mixing that in there, and so as it does that, it takes those vapor bubbles, which, like I discussed in another earlier video, there's always the presence of vapor bubbles in propane liquid. It's just that normally, when everything's static and under pressure, the bubbles are very small, they're very tight. And then as they go through the pump, normally from like here down to here, they're just going to stay compressed in the liquid, and then they'll just run right through the pump and they won't pose an issue. But now they're coming through and they're larger and larger, and the pump vanes are swinging around and they're compressing them, and it's the compression of the propane vapor in there that is our cavitation. The way to mitigate that is just slow your pump down. We want to minimize that tail. We don't really want that tail getting in there. A good visual cue, it's not an accurate comparison, but it's a good comparison, is draining water out of a large sink or draining water out of a bathtub. Difference between house plumbing and this kind of plumbing is that house drainage has to have a vent, and we're not necessarily needing a vent for this to drain, but the principle is the same. You can watch it, and depends on a lot of different little factors, but you'll always get a whirlpool, especially if you're letting it just run with no restriction. You're going to get a whirlpool, and then you'll get that gurgling noise as that whirlpool, the tail of it, starts going in and out of the drain. Same basic principle here. We want to mitigate against that. And the best way that I know of, that I've ever seen, or I've ever done, is to slow your pump down. And then we're going to minimize that tail going in there. So I explained that to the driver. He told me, he said, he'd never heard of that before. I said, well, I'm not surprised. Most drivers don't know about it. Or if they were taught it, they've chosen not to follow it. So we did that. We offloaded it the way I told him we were going to offload it, because he's offloading my place. He'll offload the way I tell him to. So we did that and proved that it was empty. One of the reasons also, a lot of drivers are trained, how are you going to know if you're a transport driver if your trailer's empty? I've been around transports, offloading and stuff in one form or another for about over 30 years. And ask the guys, they say, well, you know you're going to be empty because your pump starts making a lot of noise. And then quite often the hose will start to vibrate. And then if there's a sight glass in the bulk plant you're offloading into, you'll just get looking and looking for it to just get more and more clear. Well, when your pump's making a change in noise, it's because it's cavitating. And when your hose starts vibrating, it's because that pump is throwing out a combination of vapor and liquid, vapor and liquid, vapor and liquid. And it's affecting it, and that's causing pulsation in the hose. Also, they're convinced that if they go any slower, it'll take too long to offload. Well, it may indeed add time. It may indeed add 8 or 12 minutes to your offload to slow everything down when you get to a certain percent. But it will extend the life of your pump, and it will go a lot farther toward ensuring you completely empty out this trailer. So back to the story. I tell the driver, I said, well, there's no way to know if you left product in or my meters had gone bad except to empty your trailer back into my system, void out the ticket we just created, and then reload you again, this time monitoring the whole loading process. So that's exactly what we did. Brought him back around, loaded, everything was great. Everything was as it should be. And then I kept monitoring the next 10 trucks that came and loaded at my place. Everybody was fine. I had no reason to believe there's anything wrong with my meters then. I have no reason to believe there's anything wrong with my meters now. It was just a good learning experience, so I just throw that out there to you. If you ever have a driver that ever shows up at your place and they just overfill and they programmed in the same number of gallons, there's a good possibility they left liquid in there. Now, this driver probably should have caught that there was liquid still in the trailer. Maybe there's something wrong with his float gauge, because it's a float gauge. They're just simple little gear things and a float. They can be off by several percent. That's not uncommon. But I think the nut of it is he made the same mistake we all make. Sometimes we see what we want to see. We hear what we want to hear. When we expect certain things, too often that's what we see, whether that's reality or not. It's just part of why we have a checklist, part of why we have procedures to try to verify in more ways than one. So, just want to throw that out there in case you guys run into anything like that. That's what I had, that's how I had to deal with it. So, hopefully it can share something important and maybe save you from a little bit of grief or give you an idea of what to do or what not to do. Thank you.